Welcome to The Scoop, NANP's monthly educational webinar series. I am your host, Andrea Granson, Education Program Specialist for the NANP. These webinars are recorded, and everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording. NANP members can earn 1 continuing education credit for participating in Scoop webinars by taking the corresponding quiz, which can be found in the membership area of the NANP website. Today's webinar will conclude with a Q&A session, so please feel free to type in your questions as we go along so that we can get to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's get started. Today's presenter is Dr. Leslie Krohn. Dr. Leslie has a PhD in behavioral medicine from the Union Institute, an MPH from Harvard School of Public Health, and an MA in cross-cultural health psychology from Lesley University. Dr. Leslie is also licensed in mental health counseling with 3 national board certifications: polarity therapy, therapeutic massage, and bodywork. Dr. Leslie is also an approved clinical supervisor and certified in functional nutrition therapy. Dr. Leslie is the author of 9 books, including Natural Woman, Herbal Remedies for Radiant Health at Every Age and Stage of Life. Welcome, Leslie. Thank you for joining us today, and it is over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you for the invitation to be with you today. We are going to look at nutrition and integrative medicine for diabetes, cognitive decline, and Alzheimer's. And I wanted to share with you this image from my institute. And this 1-hour webinar today really is a 1-hour abstract of my 25-hour certification course that is a CE course. So I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you enjoy some of what we touch upon. Some of what I'll address today is going to be geared just toward the concept of nutrition, but I wanted to share with you a little bit about how I organize my whole practice, because it's truly integrative with nutrition as foundational. I'm a very big proponent of bioindividuality. There's no one right diet for everyone, and that applies to diabetes and also cognitive decline and Alzheimer's. Because I work internationally, I've had the pleasure and honor of learning about diverse indigenous food systems. So I work with the Inuit, who, as you may know, live what we would consider a very keto diet, lots of fat, some protein, very low carb. But I also work in the tropics, where it's a much higher carb, lower fat diet. And so that's the essence, that we're working with supporting the individual and not an ideology. I'm a big believer in an integrative assessment. Some of you know my work as a specialist in mental health nutrition, so I believe that we all benefit from knowing other disciplines' approach to assessment. Even if we're not going to carry it out, it gives us the language to collaborate and communicate in our niche practice. And speaking of which, I'm passionate about our topic today being an opportunity for you to not only expand the area that you're working in currently, but even to develop a niche practice, because the growing need is so exponential. There's tremendous need out there for what we're doing in this field. I'm going to touch a little bit about biological rhythms and how nutrition can help balance those. Nature, the human animal, as our approaches, the use of supplementation, herbs, hydrotherapy and detoxification, hormone therapies, exercise, somatics and bodywork, breath, spirituality, if that's important to my client, altered states of consciousness, and then adherence. We all know in our work that we can develop the best program, we can get buy-in verbally, but the very best program means nothing if we can't help our clients actually carry it out. So what are some of those strategies that are going to be unique to each individual personality? Let's touch a bit on demographics. And because I've got so much content to share, I'm not going to read slides. I may highlight a few important points. And really the point of this slide is the exponential growth of diabetes type 2, and that's our focus today, not diabetes 1, diabetes 2 and 3. And very particularly, diabetes affects minority populations disproportionately. As you'll see, diabetes actually begins not with food insecurity, not with poor food quality or sedentism. It begins with stress. And as you know, the role of chronic stress as it disrupts glucose metabolism really sets the stage. And for many people, being minority in the United States is to be stressed just by nature of being minority. And so that's an important part of my work too, and particularly in the assessment process. Likewise, we have just about similar rates of Alzheimer's. And I saw very recently that even though some of Alzheimer's, AKA diabetes type 3, seem to be reducing in prevalence over the last few years, we now have new research showing it is rising exponentially. Different types of diabetes. I mentioned diabetes type 1, often referred to as insulin dependent, used to be referred to as juvenile, considered autoimmune disease. Interestingly, some very interesting research at Cornell Department of Nutrition has linked the use of bovine dairy early in life to the development of diabetes type 1. But our focus is diabetes type 2, non-insulin dependent diabetes. 90% of cases are diabetes type 2. Now, of course, there's gestational diabetes. In my certificate program, I go into that quite a bit. Now, the latest language that we're using for dementia and Alzheimer's is diabetes type 3, which is really insulin resistance in the brain. So we get to help people manage their glucose and prevent a whole variety of diseases. And I use disease, but being out of ease with oneself. Diabetes is a risk factor for dementia, and 60 to 80% of all dementia cases are Alzheimer's. Now, we also see often a mix of vascular dementia and Alzheimer's. And as you can imagine, there are many streams leading into the same outcome, just like we're working with people to enhance their heart health, cardiovascular challenges. There are many antecedents that lead to common symptoms. We know hyperglycemia, stress, and genetics all plays a role. Also, depression and PTSD are risk factors. Now, this illuminates for us some opportunities when we're working with people who are coming to us with a variety of symptoms. I'm not digesting well, I can't sleep well, yes, I have a history of traumatic events, yes, I have adverse childhood events, I've been depressed for years, I'm depressed since I lost my job. We know all of these are ongoing chronic risk factors that lead in large part to physiological changes that actually shrink the brain. And we'll talk about that in a moment. We're all familiar with metabolic syndrome, which really gives us some initial insight as early risk factors that lead down that yellow brick road to prediabetes and then diabetes. We're seeing high rates of PCOS in our young people. I actually saw a young woman the other day, 9 years old, gallbladder full of gallstones due to a high trans fat diet. So any number of these areas are areas that we may intervene in, or we may be collaborating with practitioners as the nutritional consultant and advisor. We have a criteria for diagnosis of prediabetes as about 100 to 125 milligrams. Now, that's a little high when we think of in the natural medicine or naturopathic or functional nutrition community. We like to see it as low as 90. When we start seeing it at around 90, 95, our ears start to perk up a little bit. The same thing with A1C. We want to keep that A1C low. And sometimes, even though glucose may be low on a spot check, we want to look at that A1C over time. And I can tell you from clinical practice, we can have tremendous results with suggesting nutritional change added to exercise. And while I think it's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about here, I know many of us ourselves are athletes. We love to exercise. Tremendous evidence pointing to weight interventions, meaning weight training, because as you know, as we increase muscle mass, we metabolize glucose much more efficiently. So just a heads up to those of you recommending and getting out there exercising in your groups with your clients. Now, for the criteria for type 2 diabetes diagnosis, we're up a little higher to minimum of 126 milligrams. And again, we set a lower bar in integrative or functional approaches. And one can test this in the office. Normally one comes to us with their tests. And the same thing with our A1C scores at 6.5. It's a little higher than we'd like to see. Now, there's an important link between psychiatry related to adherence. Depression is one of the major causes of why people cannot carry out a nutritional and activity program. And this is bidirectional. Having diabetes causes depression, and depressed individuals have a 60% increased risk of developing diabetes. Diabetes is depressing, and being depressed makes one much more vulnerable to diabetes. And I mentioned PTSD is as well. Now, this is important if we're working with veterans, if we're working with survivors, keeping in mind, even if many people are not trained in mental health, what I've observed both as a mental health practitioner, nutritional therapist, and a body worker is that often people don't go to their counselor, don't go to psychotherapy. There's a stigma. They may come to us to work on their diet, and yet we have an opportunity to refer and collaborate and recognize all of these interrelationships, even if we're not going to carry out all the interventions ourselves. Let's keep in mind the medications that can cause or even exacerbate glucose dysregulation. The glucocorticoids, which are commonly used, I would suggest overused at times for allergies, autoimmune, fatigue, and pain. The atypical antipsychotics are a major cause of glucose dysregulation. They cause tremendous cravings, and part of my clinical practice is collaborating with prescribers to find alternatives to these antipsychotics. And then, of course, post-transplant HIV meds and malignancy, and I'm not going to get into that much. Those are fait accompli, and people need that for support, and we're going to help people manage that. Aspect of the delta desaturase enzyme in diabetes. We recall that trans fats inhibit the conversion of linoleic acid to GLA, which is our anti-inflammatory. It's the delta desaturase enzyme that converts linoleic acid and ALA to its biologically active compounds. Diabetes dysregulates this enzyme and dysregulates the fatty acid metabolism. So we have a conversion problem of fatty acids in diabetes. Likely, there were many antecedents to this conversion problem that even contributed to diabetes. So when this action is blocked, the entire pathway of conversion is blocked. And this is important for us both as the anti-inflammatory function, but also, as you'll see when we get into cognitive decline and brain health and the necessity for high levels of these essential fatty acids for good quality brain health. Now, there's evidence that there are genetic alterations and contributions to the desaturase enzyme. And would you believe that also we see this across ethnicity? I wear another hat besides as director of my clinic and running my institute. I also work for a Native nonprofit organization. We do a lot of food revitalization and traditional medicine support. Would you believe that because of the chronic exposure to endemic high levels of essential fatty acids, let's take Northwest Native individuals and communities, the Irish, Scots, and the Ainu in northern Japan often have a deficiency in this enzyme because they ate so much in traditional diet, so much essential fatty acids, the DHA, EPA in seal oil, whale, or ulican, also known as smelt, that actually the enzyme said, hey, I'm not needed here. I'm getting plenty of this. But now with modern diets, which are often too high in carbohydrates, too high in wheats and oils and fats that people cannot biologically metabolize, this is where we also see a contribution to genetic, really genomically informed vulnerability. So keep this in mind also when you're working across cultures. So let's look at some specific vitamins that can help metabolize and synergize the desaturase activity. We know that low levels of B6, magnesium, and zinc interfere with production. That gives us a clue of what's going to help. Biotin, vitamin E, ELA supplementation, I think, is your first go-to to overcome challenges to conversion. And keep in mind, we often see in these populations the combination of depression and skin problems. This is what makes GLA supplementation. And I generally supplement at 500 milligrams in children. And by the age of 18, we go up to 1,000 milligrams a day. Something like borage oil, even evening primrose oil or black currant seed oil. We know GLA is very important for neuropathies. I like evening primrose, particularly for vascular function. Oh, and I'm sorry, I did not delete this reference to one of the sources I use. I use a number of sources of these optimal EFAs here, but I don't have an earnings from that mention, but I like a number of different products, including biotic. MCI, mild cognitive impairment or decline in diabetes. We know that poor glycemic control is a contributing factor. Brain insulin resistance is a risk factor. And people with diabetes have higher incidence of all-cause dementia. What are some other risk factors? Mild cognitive decline is also called prodromal Alzheimer's. We used to think, oh, they're aging, they've got memory loss, but we now know that memory loss is not intrinsically natural to the aging process, unlike what we used to believe. So someone who's beginning to experience mild cognitive decline, I'm not suggesting, oh, I forgot where I put my keys. I'm suggesting, oh, I don't even remember that I had keys. That's a difference that we might look at. Someone who's depressed, someone who's apathetic, who has a sense of hopelessness, all that combined together may be significant of mild cognitive decline. And that's where in nutrition, I would refer them to an assessment. We know that 15 to 20% of people over 65 have mild cognitive decline, and it often transitions into dementia. 50% of brain neurons in the hippocampus are dead by the time symptoms occur. And you remember I mentioned the role of chronic stress and the role particularly of bathing neurons in excess cortisol, which destroys brain neurons, causes the brain to shrink. We see in MRIs and functional PET scans shrunk brains in, let's say, veterans with PTSD who are depressed. And we'll talk a little bit about how we mitigate those symptoms and the potential for even stopping them and reversing them. Age, family, history, depression, PTSD, as I mentioned, even disrupted circadian rhythm, as we hear a great deal about the importance of sleep, lymphatic function, detoxification of the brain, history of smoking, TBI, traumatic brain injury. Anybody who's got traumatic brain injury is going to be a potential risk factor for dementia 10, 20, 30 years later. And this goes for our children who are getting concussions as well. So let's take a moment to look at a very important genetic risk factor that we in nutrition can address, because I think it, again, speaks to status. Now, each person has 2 copies of this gene, and this determines what's called our genotype. So there are 3 types. There's the ApoE2, the 3, and the 4. And you can have any number of these combinations, as you see here. Now, the 2 is the rarest form, and it appears actually to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's by up to 40%. The 3 seems kind of neutral. It doesn't seem to influence risk at all. However, it's the ApoE4 allele that exists in approximately 10 to 15% of people that has been found scientifically to increase the risk. It's not a fait accompli, but it increases the risk and lowers the age of onset. So what we know, the science tells us that 1 copy of E4, perhaps an E2, E4, maybe that's offset a little bit more, can increase your risk by 30%, while 2 copies can increase it by 50. I've even seen up to 70%. Now, not everyone with a 3-4 or 4-4 gets Alzheimer's, and not everyone by a long shot who has Alzheimer's is a 3-4 or 4-4. Only 60% of people with Alzheimer's have a 4 allele. So that points to a portion of the population has a genetic risk, but that genetic risk can be mitigated. Now, what is the ApoE4 about? Without going into huge detail here, I want to just tweak your interest. This is about challenges in the transport of cholesterol. And this is why the ApoE4 also confers risk factor for heart disease. And so I want you to just consider that the ApoE4 may have more challenges metabolizing the saturated fats, suggesting that these may be something that we're not going to be using as much with someone with ApoE4 as we might with an ApoE3. So let's talk for a moment about what we find in the psychology of cognitive decline, because again, this informs our challenges when we give someone a program and we get an agreement and we say, is this workable? And we'll go step by step. And then they come back and say, I haven't done a thing. Cognitive aging leads to an overall diminished sense of well-being. It changes our sense of identity. It increases isolation, reduces relationships. It increases fear, anxiety, depression. There's the stress of diagnosis. So people may come to us to change their diet and for recommendations right after they've been diagnosed, and they can have an additional level of depression just with the fear and concern for their future. They have a decreased purpose in life oftentimes. And in general, anxiety and depression, mild cognitive impairment predict conversion to Alzheimer's. I like to use mindfulness work in my practice. There's evidence for being able to improve memory and mood in mild cognitive impairment. And so we're often serving as not only nutritional support, but coaching. And then we may identify another member of the team to bring in. We know that toxic stress and inflammation underlie both diabetes and Alzheimer's. Stress affects the HPA axis. It contributes to inflammatory process. It alters immune. Cortisol, also known as the death hormone, as I mentioned, contributes to brain shrinkage. This all leads to poor sleep, less lymphatic function so that the brain can't detoxify well enough. And cortisol, as you know, is immunosuppressive. Um, And again, now we come to the role of plaques and tangles and contribution to neuroinflammatory process. As you well know, it's been a long-held belief that it's the plaques and tangles that are causative for Alzheimer's. However, that concept, that theory has really been turned on its head as the major theory of Alzheimer's. The amyloid proteins are now not considered the cause, but the response that leads. The plaques and tangles come out of the chronic inflammatory process in the brain. And there's some very potent interventions nutritionally that have been found and herbally to help reduce and dissolve these plaques and tangles that are getting in the way of neuronal communication. Now, let's look at some of these additional drug exposures. We looked at them earlier for diabetes. What about for the risk of dementia? There's nearly a 50% increase in risk of dementia if you're using the anticholinergic antidepressants, including Benadryl, the anti-Parkinsonian drugs, the antipsychotics, and then some of the bladder antimuscarinics and the antiepileptics. The research suggests that the equivalent use, daily use for 3 years. And this again speaks to where we in nutrition can intervene early to prevent or collaborate to help people transition into other nutritional options. The long-term use of metformin, ironically, which is the go-to medication for diabetes, which, as you know, decreases vitamin B12 levels significantly, appears to double the risk for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, along with anesthetic agents also associated with the increased risk of dementia. Also, the psychotropics, which are commonly used, the SSRIs, are associated with an increase in the odds of developing dementia, especially in people over 65. And we've got very high rates of depression in people over 65. And this, I think, offers us a great niche opportunity. When I had my practice in Olympia, Washington, I was cooking and movement classes with caregivers. And it was so much fun to teach crockpot cooking, how to cook a great meal, how to make a great smoothie in a short period of time. Then we'd get out and move. And it was uplifting for me. It was uplifting for them. I love working and doing this work in groups. Of course, we're on hold for that for a while, but I think there's an opportunity for even Zoom work. So feel very creative about how you can engage different communities with this knowledge. One thing that's a very interesting side effect of middle to later stage dementia, you may be familiar with the term sundowning. This is agitation, confusion, anxiety in the late afternoon and evening due to a reduced production of melatonin and to an increase and one of the then benefits of that is to increase of 3 grams. Remember I mentioned brain shrinkage. The suprachiasmatic notch in the brain is part of the hypothalamic area that shrinks. And so therefore, circadian rhythm is disrupted in dementia. And so I do a lot of supplementation, and even there's some good research on essential oils for reducing that agitation. I think we're all familiar with our foundational work in supporting the microbiome, decreasing intestinal permeability, decreasing dysbiosis, enhancing good levels of bacteria. I'm a big fan of the use of glutamine. I like to begin many of my clients on 1 month of glutamine combined with turmeric, just to start to heal that intestinal permeability. Now, I touched on circadian rhythm, our 24-hour sleep-wake cycle. Disruption of this pain, stress, PTSD. In nutrition, if we can help re-regulate this rhythm, we help all of these symptoms that people bring to us. And research suggests that disruption accelerates diabetes because it increases pancreatic beta cell loss and dysfunction. What do I use to help reset circadian rhythm? I mentioned exposure to morning light. Methylcobalamin, vitamin B12, enhances light sensitivity of the clock. It regulates cortisol peak. The use of the mineral lithium, up to 450 micrograms a day. We know that it is very neuroprotective of the brain. Those of you familiar with the use of lithium carbonate for bipolar disease, which by the way is a disruption of circadian rhythm. If anybody here is from an area where there's mineral springs, I'm from, for example, Mount Tahoma, Mount Rainier, where there's Ohanapekosh mineral springs called Laughing Springs by native Yakima because it's rich in lithium and it makes you giggle. It lifts your mood. It's protective of neurons. Now, we can't all go soak in these lithium springs, but we can supplement with low dose mineral lithium. I also like low dose melatonin, 0.5 to 3 milligrams. I don't know about you, but I notice a lot of people overdosing on melatonin and giving melatonin to children. And while children are still in puberty, I don't think melatonin is called for. I much prefer an alternative to help them sleep. What else can we do? Of course, supporting with the fat-soluble vitamins. Low levels of D are associated with diabetes and dementia. Increased levels of vitamin E appear to decrease the risk of cognitive decline in Alzheimer's. And that makes sense because it aids vascular health, aids oxygenation and transport into the brain. Vitamin K and K2, essential for nerve health as well. And there's some evidence for using the tocotrienols separate from the tocopherols when using vitamin E complex. I imagine, like me, you're seeing a lot of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, another sign of metabolic syndrome. This is where there's accumulation of fat in the liver, not due to alcohol use. We're seeing this a lot related to poor quality fats. This often precedes the development of type 2 diabetes, and this can or through liver enzymes, generally through ultrasound is how people find it. I think the number one go-to supplement for this is phosphatidylcholine. It's a normal constituent of bile. It facilitates fat emulsification. It provides choline to the body, which can be synthesized from methionine or serine. It's an essential nutrient. We've got to get it from the diet. And those of you who remember our foremother, Adele Davis, what did she always recommend that we use? She recommended lecithin granules, and she was touting the value of phosphatidylcholine back in the 50s and 60s. So what are some of our nutrients for the rescue? We've got pomegranate seed extract, very rich in anthocyanins, very powerful antioxidants. Berberine, I think those stabilizers. We find it in plants, but you can also find it in substances. R-alpha lipoic acid, green tea extract for scolin, acetyl L-carnitine, grapeseed quercetin, and on with this list. I think one of my favorites is chromium, because so many of our clients have carbohydrate cravings. So when someone's sugar is a little high, they tell me they crave lots of carbohydrates. And remember, I don't know about you, but no one ever comes to me and says, "Oh, Dr. Korn, help me, I'm craving carrots and celery." No, they are craving the refined carbs. And chromium is a very potent intervention that you can use. It's cost effective. It aids glucose metabolism, aids glucose uptake, but it also reduces carb craving. And so that may be where I might start. You see CoQ10, of course, because many of our patients are also on statins. CoQ10 is going to support mitochondrial health, which is also underlying dementia and diabetes risk. Taurine, I like to use taurine, not only because it's helpful for the liver and gallbladder, but if I have someone that's got high blood pressure, I can work with the prescriber to help reduce high blood pressure by incorporating taurine. Of course, vanadium is a wonderful complement to chromium as well. And here's just a little bit about what's behind the value of berberine and some dosing for you. I know my time's going to run short, so you'll have access to these slides for some of this specific dosing information. B12, I think that's one of our first places to go. You know that I mentioned metformin depletes B12. We know that vegans and vegetarians are at risk of low B12, therefore poorer cognitive decline. Elders, people on a budget who aren't getting enough animal protein, due to food insecurity. We always want to assess B12 when we're looking at cognitive decline in elders. And here's some information on chromium. Sometimes you can find a supplement that's called glucose tolerance factor that combines chromium with agar gum or maybe another kind of a fiber. It potentiates the action of insulin and also is maybe combined with niacin, or you may use niacin or even niacinamide separately. And have any of you noticed the co-occurrence between diabetes and arthritis, both linked to inflammatory? We use at about 1,500 milligrams, 500 milligrams 3 times a day. Here's our vitamin D, our neurohormone, and how important it is. And I wanted to share some research if you're working with women and families in pregnancy, that women with low D levels during pregnancy were 3 times more likely to develop gestational diabetes. So we've got some very simple, cost-effective approaches that don't need to break the bank of many of our clients. And I think when people feel they can do 1 or 2 things and move in the right direction, that enhances adherence as well. And here's a little bit more on taurine. I mentioned that a moment ago. Here's a little bit more on lithium, NAF, and neurotrophin 3. There's a great deal of research on the role of lithium. Again, not an expensive mineral. And those of you who are looking for some professional development, go test this out on yourself. Soak in some mineral springs in the Northwest this summer, or in Texas, or in Mexico, we have mineral springs. And in New Mexico, we've got mineral springs. Let's talk about my approach to sleep and anxiety. Again, we can have sleep and anxiety issues as a result of a diagnosis, or they can co-occur with depression, PTSD, which is all a risk factor for depression. And then, of course, with cognitive decline and aging in general, it's not that we don't need as much sleep as we age, it's that melatonin levels start to drop and sleep becomes more fitful. So anything we can get to sleep, but also duration, extending sleep, we're going to enhance cognitive health and we're going to reduce risk of diabetes. I love a product called Lactium. That's the generic term. It's basically milk neuropeptides. It was synthesized in France, about 150 to 450 milligrams 2 times a day for anxiety, or at 450 milligrams before sleep. Also, inositol, 1 to 3 grams during the day, will reduce anxiety and also enhance sleep. And these are some of my favorite herbal combinations: valerian, hops, and passion flower. Here you see a beautiful passion flower from my garden. We know through research it decreases sleep latency and lengthens sleep duration. Now, you remember I mentioned the HPA axis, which is in many that we want to bring into balance for the stress response. Licorice root, really revered in Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic, even American Indian herbal medicine, regulates the HPA axis. Now, the only contraindication for, let's say, a licorice root tea, don't overdo it if you've got hypertension, because licorice root is so rich in sodium, potassium, it causes a little bit of fluid retention at high doses. A few times a week, a few cups is fine. Of course, we use it for soothing gastric upset as well. So just be aware of the use of licorice root. It's potent, but it's also got its contraindications. Here's what I call the three sisters of sleep again, and I encourage you to explore more detail and some of the science of it in my blog. Supporting not just with foods, but maybe nutritional nutrients and herbal medicines. Let's keep in mind, nutrients can cause the excretion of certain medications. They can affect the P450 enzymes. They also can potentiate and synergize certain medications, especially the hypoglycemic. So, for example, if I'm going to use berberine and taurine and lithium, then I'm going to work with the prescriber, because someone may be able to reduce and even eventually get off their dose of metformin. But I will always do this hand in hand with the prescriber. So just be aware of these contraindications. And I always run a drug nutrient herb interaction where I want to see what's going to potentiate, what's contraindicated, and what I want to stay away from. And I've given you some references here for that. So in general, what are some of our clinical goals? We want to manage the stress response as the underlying disruption that leads the way to the development of metabolic syndrome, diabetes type 2, cognitive decline, and eventually dementia. We want to balance circadian rhythm, enhance neuronal communication, address epigenetics, reduce inflammation and oxidative stress, reduce the exposure to medications by exploring that in your intake and seeing where you can get some of that improvement, working with the prescriber. Reduce, stabilize, and control blood glucose levels with diet and exercise, mindfulness, even body work. I was very fortunate to be funded by the National Institutes of Health to study body work in its ability to reduce stress and depression and reduce blood glucose levels. And we all need it these days. Function, reduce arterial and venous inflammation, improve and enhance arterial strength, circulation to the extremities and the brain, also improve vision. And stay tuned, there's a new test on the way that can actually diagnose dementia and Alzheimer's by looking in the retina of the eye, the windows to the mind. Enhance GLA levels. I would say most of my clients can use GLA. We're often recommending krill or fish oil. wonderful, but always balance it out with the GLA. If we're working with late stage, reduce pain, improve restorative sleep, enhance glymphatic function, manage depression, because it's the depression, also called learned helplessness, that depresses the sense of I can do it. It depresses self-efficacy. Do something, put that into the mix. Stabilize stress hormones, enhance endogenous hormones. And in my certification course, I talk about the role of hormones and cognitive health and diabetes. Enhance the endocannabinoid system, enhance mitochondrial energy to support increased physical activity, which is just going to have positive reverberating effects all the way around. What are our clinical practice opportunities? Screening and assessment. Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. You have specialized knowledge. You can become an expert in this area where no one else is. And so you can bring what you know to other practitioners who don't have the time or the knowledge, and collaborate, teach. You're going to have opportunities to manage a pyramid that we see so often. Prevention at all stages, and then the intervention. You're going to have approaches to treating non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, pain interventions, addressing and tailoring genomic influences. You may be asking about testing for ApoE. Work with your naturopath, work with your functional medicine practitioner. It's not an expensive test as well. You may have ideas for working with prescribers to reduce alternatives to med use, cognitive enhancement, and then working with a mental health focus, the role of high carb, the role of self-medication that's associated with alcohol, depression, PTSD. Beginning to learn about this is going to give you a leg up in helping people with diabetes and dementia. Let's not forget the caregivers. Coaching, the role of groups. I find groups for this kind of work almost better than individual work, and the research bears this out, because the group supports each other. And then, of course, giving talks, giving webinars, and presenting yourself and building your expertise in your community. For those of you interested in more of what I do, these are some of my books. I think actually they are all of my books, all of which are in hard copy and Kindle. I've got a couple in Spanish as well. Those of you that are working in Spanish-speaking communities, I've got free resources and infographics and blogs in Spanish, so lots of free materials as well. And I invite you, if this topic is something you're passionate about, consider our 25-hour series. Much for your attendance, and I hope we've got a few minutes for some Q&A. Thank you.
We do, Leslie. Thank you. That was fantastic. Well, I don't know about anybody else, but I was writing lots of notes there. That was awesome. Yes, so as Dr. Leslie has just mentioned, earlier this month, we approved the program for 25 CEUs. So tomorrow, a link to the recording will be sent out, and I will also share the link if anyone wants to check that program out. So yes, we do have some questions. So one of the first questions here: if a person has been on metformin, what should be done, in place of sort of being on these diabetes medications? Because I think you said 3 years was like the benchmark of when we could start to see problems.
Yes, I think it always depends on what stage they're at too, and if they're on other medications. What I like to do is work with the prescriber, number one, in addressing what are the common nutritional deficiencies as a result of metformin. Now, metformin isn't really artificially lowers blood glucose. So what you want to do is think about what are the things that we can do nutritionally and through nutrients that will not interact negatively with metformin and will enhance well-being. That's where I begin. And then what we do is we create a plan with the prescriber to potentially reduce the metformin. Sometimes it's 10 milligrams at a time, 50 milligrams at a time. It really depends the stage that someone is in. Have they just gone on metformin because they didn't have good nutritional advice from you and they didn't know what to do and their high carb diet wasn't doing it? Because let's face it, it's this high refined carb diet that lets you know, oh, I can't digest this stuff. I'm not metabolizing it. Most of the time, people are going to benefit from increasing fiber, non-soluble fiber, which slows the uptake of glucose. This is where I would put someone on berberine, on B12. I think my initial go-to is always a good, solid B vitamin complex. I love a B vitamin complex that's rich in minerals like chromium and vanadium. So I might begin there. I might add a little GLA, go step by step, add in some berberine, and then let's see, someone may find, and this is where you're going to be careful, that their blood glucose is lowering and they don't need as much metformin to get that effect. And I usually schedule with people change and review change on an every 3-month period. I encourage people by saying, look, this has been building for a long time. Let's take a year to achieve our results. We're not in a rush, and we're going to go incrementally making change every 3 months. And then they can get tested every 3 months and for their A1C. And that's how we chart it out. So I begin with a good, solid, natural B vitamin rich with chromium and vanadium. I would put them on 1,000 milligrams of GLA. I would begin to look at maybe 500 milligrams of berberine and might move up to 1,500, maybe even a niacinamide as well. But go step by step and watch how change occurs.
Wow, that was a fantastic and comprehensive answer. Thank you for that. So can individuals who are dairy intolerant take lectin?
That's a great question. It depends on the nature of the intolerance. The lactium is casein, so it's the protein element rather than the lactose, the sugar element. I have not seen any negative reactions to people who are even casein sensitive. As I mentioned, this was synthesized in France, where interestingly enough, it's considered a prescription medication. In the United States, it's over the counter. You know, if you're concerned about the casein with your dairy intolerant person, your casein intolerant person, and we know there are plenty, then I might not use it, and that's where I might use the VHP, the valerian hops and passion flower instead. This is what's so great about nature. She, he, they has given us plenty of options and plenty of redundancy.
Yes, oh, of course, absolutely. And then another one, can individuals intolerant to gluten take hops?
Take what?
Hops.
Oh, gee, that's a good question. I don't see why not.
Okay.
But I may not be familiar with gluten in hops. I know hops is estrogenic, and so you just want to be careful. That's why it's so good for perimenopausal and menopausal women. But I'm not familiar with gluten in hops, so that may be, I don't have a good answer for you there, but let's look that up.
Okay. All right. So the dosage for GLA, did you say it was 1,000?
I think 1,000 is a good amount, yes.
Okay. All right. Would you support a diet based only on plants because of the saturated and trans fats that are thought to be a risk?
Not only on plants, but I would not go the keto approach with someone either. I think a plant-based diet with some animal protein is generally how a majority of the population does well. Now, we've got a whole spectrum, and it's certainly beyond what we have time here for. But let's just say that probably someone with the ApoE4, which is what we're talking about, they're going to do better with a plant-based, on the plant-based side of the spectrum, our plants, our nuts. I would still look at seeds and lower on the grain side. But many people still do well. For example, one of our best foods, if you're not allergic to it, are eggs. They're rich in choline, which, as you know, transforms into acetylcholine, our learning and memory neurotransmitter. And sometimes we'll supplement with choline, or I recommend anybody will benefit, whether you're talking about cognitive issues in the young, like what's called ADHD at times, or memory loss, or cognitive decline, 2 to 3 eggs farm fresh a day. So I wouldn't say only plant-based. I would say heavy use of plants and nuts and fruits. However, with some animal products, I think many people do well with that. And it's not that people won't do well with some saturated fats, but not heavy saturated fats.
Okay, fantastic. And someone, Brandon, thank you very much. He's just said hops do not have gluten. Gluten in beer comes from the malted barley. So there we go. We got an answer there to that one.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
And I have a question. You mentioned that there's been some research on essential oils. I personally, what would come to mind for me is rosemary, but I don't know if you had any others that you've seen in the research.
Oh, I love rosemary oil. Well, this research was fascinating because we were very interested in how to reduce the agitation that makes caregiving so difficult at middle stages. And I imagine, I was a caregiver of a mother with Alzheimer's for many years. And so I got to know many other people. I imagine we have people in our audience who are doing this beautiful service right now for an elder. And so one of the biggest challenges is the agitation and the anxiety. And the research shows that the essential oil Melissa reduces agitation in sundowning. And so one of the things that we do, I've got a recipe for a delicious smoothie for both the caregiver and the patient, the family member oftentimes, that they can take midday. And then before the agitation sets in, which is generally around 4 p.m, when the sun starts to dip, you give someone a nice coconut oil with a little bit of Melissa hand massage, or a foot massage, and that relaxation, the wafting of the aroma, and of course the tactile touch is so soothing, because part of the agitation at particularly middle to late stages is people are still perceiving what's going on, but they can't express it. And we see this in stroke as well. There's a lot that's very similar with stroke. And so nonverbal, tactile, aroma-based touch, along with a delicious smoothie, you can't beat that.
I've recently learnt about Melissa, so that's very interesting. Thank you very much. Well, we are pretty much at the end of the presentation and most of the questions. We have, of course, your email address here. So if anyone wants to, reach out to Dr. Leslie, we can see here her email address is there on that slide. I just want to check, is it okay when I send the recording? Can I send the slides?
Oh, sure. You bet.
Okay, fantastic. I just wanted to get your permission on that.
Thank you for asking. I really, as I say, I abstracted some of this from our course, and I think it's a good jumping off point for people. And I was so happy a few years ago, I was at the NANP presenting, so I'm hoping I've met some of you that I can't see right now. So please feel free to drop me a note and say hello.
Oh, yes. And speaking of which, we have the call for presenters is open. So I don't know if you saw that, but you're most welcome.
Great.
Yeah, it closes September 4th. So I can certainly share you a link if you're interested. And also not just a call for speakers, but we also do a workshop. So I don't know if you're aware of that, and we can certainly talk offline about that. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. This has been a really great presentation. Okay, so next month our presentation will be nutrient-dense preconception, pregnancy and postpartum nutrition with Sarah Russell, NTP. So please mark your calendars for Thursday, September the 17th. Until then, have a great rest of your day, and thank you everybody so much, and of course to you, Dr. Leslie Korn, for joining us today. Bye for now.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.